Journalism wasn't supposed to be dangerous in a town of 3,200 people. I moved to Clearwater, Montana in 2022 because I was tired of the grind, tired of chasing clicks for online publications, tired of the constant pressure to produce content that would go viral, tired of living in a cramped apartment in Portland where I could hear my neighbors' arguments through paper-thin walls. Clearwater seemed like the antidote to all of that. A small town nestled in a valley about 90 miles north of Missoula, surrounded by mountains, with a main street that still had family-owned businesses and a weekly newspaper called the Clearwater Chronicle that had been publishing since 1889. When the editor position opened up, the previous editor had retired after 40 years. I applied on a whim. To my surprise, they hired me. My name is Emma Hartley, and I'm 31 years old. I have a degree in journalism from the University of Oregon and 7 years of experience writing for publications that no longer exist because digital media is a graveyard of failed business models. I thought Clearwater would be a fresh start, a place where journalism still meant something, where I could write stories that mattered to a community that factually read them. I had no idea what I was walking into. The first 6 months were exactly what I'd hoped for. I wrote about city council meetings, high school sports, local businesses, the county fair. I interviewed farmers about drought conditions, covered fundraisers for the volunteer fire department, profiled elderly residents who'd lived in Clearwater their entire lives. It was wholesome, meaningful work that felt important in a way my previous journalism never had. The Chronicle office was in a historic building on Main Street, right next to the town's only coffee shop. The previous editor, Douglas Pritchard, had left behind an archive of every issue ever published, bound volumes dating back to 1889, stored in the basement. I spent my lunch breaks down there sometimes, reading through old issues, marveling at how little the town had changed in some ways and how much it had transformed in others. The trouble started in November 2023, when I decided to write a retrospective piece for the Chronicle's 135th anniversary. I wanted to tell the story of the newspaper's founding, the history of Clearwater itself, the settlers who'd established the town in the late 1880s. I started with the obvious sources: the town's historical society, the library archives, the old issues of the Chronicle itself. The official history was straightforward. Clearwater was founded in 1889 by a group of homesteaders led by a man named Josiah Thorne. They'd come west looking for farmland and found this valley with its river, its fertile soil, and its stunning mountain views. They built homes, established businesses, created a community, the typical American frontier story. But as I dug deeper, I started noticing inconsistencies. The first edition of the Clearwater Chronicle was dated March 15, 1889, but the town's incorporation documents weren't filed until June of that year. That's not unusual. Newspapers often preceded official incorporation, but what was strange was that the first edition made references to recent events and the settlement of last fall, suggesting the town had been established months earlier than the official founding date indicated. I found a letter in the Historical Society archives, dated November 1888, from Josiah Thorne to his brother back east. In it, Thorne described arriving in the valley and finding a settlement already established, though under troubled circumstances. He didn't elaborate on what those circumstances were. Another inconsistency: census records showed the town's population in 1890 was 247 people, but passenger manifests, land claim records, and other documents I could find only accounted for about 180 people who'd arrived in the area between 1888 and 1890. Where had the other 67 people come from? I mentioned these discrepancies to Margaret Sutherland, the president of the Historical Society. Margaret was in her 70s, descended from one of Clearwater's founding families, and had been involved with preserving the town's history for decades. "Oh, Emma," she said with a dismissive smile, "you're reading too much into old records. Things were chaotic on the frontier. People came and went. Records were incomplete. You can't expect perfect documentation from the 1880s. But something in her tone bothered me. It wasn't just dismissive, it was nervous, like she was trying to steer me away from something. I kept digging. In the Chronicle's basement archive, I found something strange. There was a gap in the bound volumes. The issues from October 1888 through February 1889 were missing, just those 5 months, right before the newspaper's official founding. The volumes on either side were intact, carefully preserved, but those months were simply gone. Douglas must have misplaced them when he was organizing things, Margaret suggested when I asked her about it. Or perhaps they were damaged and had to be discarded. But Douglas Pritchard was meticulous. I'd met with him before he left town, and he'd walked me through his filing system, his preservation techniques, his pride in maintaining a complete archive. He wouldn't have lost 5 months of issues. Someone had removed them deliberately. I started interviewing the oldest residents of Clearwater, people in their 80s and 90s whose grandparents had been among the original settlers. Most of them told me the same sanitized version of history that Margaret had: hardy pioneers, community cooperation, building a town from nothing. But Dorothy Chen was different. Dorothy was 94, living in a nursing home on the edge of town. Her grandmother had been among the first Chinese immigrants to settle in Clearwater in the 1990s. When I asked Dorothy about the town's founding, she got a strange look on her face. My grandmother never talked about it. But once, when I was a girl, I found her crying while looking at an old photograph. When I asked what was wrong, she said, "This town was built on graves, child. Never forget that." Graves? I asked. What did she mean? I don't know. She wouldn't explain. But she always said that the old families, the Thorns, the Sutherlands, the Pritchards, the Blackwells, they knew the truth. They kept it locked up tight. That conversation sent me down a new path. I started researching not just the town's founding, but what had been in this valley before the town existed. The area had been inhabited by the Salish people for thousands of years, though by the 1880s, most had been forced onto reservations. I contacted the Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribes, asking if they had any oral history about this particular valley. A tribal historian named James Redfeather agreed to meet with me. We sat in the Chronicle office on a cold December afternoon while he looked through old maps I'd collected. This valley, he pointed to the area where Clearwater now stood, was considered sacred ground by my ancestors. There was a village here, a place where people came for healing and spiritual ceremonies. The valley was called Stillwater in our language, the same name you now call Clearwater. What happened to the village? I asked. James's expression darkened. In the 1880s, white settlers started pushing into this region. Most indigenous people were already on reservations by then, but a small group remained in this valley trying to maintain their traditional way of life. The official history says they left peacefully, relocated to the reservation, but the oral history in our community tells a different story. What story? I asked. That there was a massacre, that settlers came in the fall of 1888 and killed everyone in the village, men, women, and children. Then they buried the bodies and built their town on top of it, and the families who did it have been covering it up ever since. I felt like I'd been punched in the stomach. Do you have proof? Only stories passed down through generations, but stories have power, Emma. Stories are how we preserve truth when written records are destroyed. I left that meeting shaken. If what James said was true, Clearwater wasn't just built on frontier ambition, it was built on genocide, and the founding families had spent 135 years hiding that fact. I needed evidence. Stories and inconsistencies weren't enough for a newspaper article that would accuse the town's most prominent families of covering up a massacre. I decided to search for physical evidence. If there had been a village in this valley, there would be archaeological remains, and if there had been a massacre, there would be human remains. I contacted Dr. Michael Torres, an archaeologist at the University of Montana who specialized in indigenous history. I explained what I'd learned and asked if he'd be willing to do a preliminary survey of the area. If what you're describing happened, Dr. Torres said, there would definitely be evidence. The question is whether anyone will let us look for it. We applied for permits to conduct a non-invasive survey, ground-penetrating radar, soil analysis, basic archaeological assessment of a section of land just outside town that, according to my research, was where the original Salish village had been. The land was now owned by the Thorne family, descendants of Josiah Thorne. The permit was denied. No explanation, just a form letter from the county saying our request didn't meet the criteria for archaeological research. That's unusual, Dr. Torres said. Those permits are usually rubber-stamped for academic research. Someone pulled strings to block this. I wrote an article for the Chronicle about the denial, framing it as a human interest piece about preserving Indigenous history. Within hours of publication, I got a call from Robert Thorne, the current patriarch of the Thorne family. "Miss Hartley, I'd like to speak with you about your article," he said. His voice was calm, but carrying an undercurrent of steel. "Would you be available to meet this evening?" We met at his house, a sprawling Victorian mansion on the hill overlooking Clearwater. Robert was in his 70s, retired from a career in banking, and one of the wealthiest men in the county. His great-great-grandfather was Josiah Thorne. "I'll be direct," Robert said, once we were seated in his study. "You're pursuing a line of inquiry that's going to cause problems for this town, problems you don't fully understand." "I'm just trying to report the truth," I said. "The truth." He smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "The truth is complicated, Miss Hartley. Yes, there was a Salish village here. Yes, there was conflict when my ancestor and his group arrived, but massacre is a strong word, and it's not accurate." "Then what would be accurate?" Robert stood and walked to a bookshelf. He pulled out a leather-bound journal, old and worn. "This is Josiah Thorne's personal diary. It's never been made public, but I think you should read the relevant entries. Then we can talk about what truth means." He opened the journal to a page marked with a ribbon. The handwriting was cramped, dated October 15, 1888. "We arrived in the valley today and found it occupied by a group of Indians, perhaps 70 souls. They seemed peaceful at first, but tensions arose when we explained our intention to settle. They claimed the land was sacred, forbidden to outsiders. We explained that the government had assigned this territory for homesteading, that they were required to relocate to the reservation. They refused." I continued reading. The entries over the next weeks described escalating tensions. The settlers began building structures. The Salish villagers asked them to leave. There were arguments, small confrontations, a general sense of rising conflict. Then came the entry from November 3, 1888. "Tragedy has befallen us all. Last night, some of our livestock were stolen and a barn was burned. 3 of our men, angry and drunk, decided to retaliate. They went to the Indian village with rifles. I didn't know of their plan until it was too late. When I reached the village, I found carnage. The 3 men had started shooting, and the Indians had fought back. In the chaos, both sides suffered terrible losses. When dawn came, 47 Indians were dead, including women and children. Of our party, 12 were killed. God forgive us. This was not supposed to happen. We came seeking new lives, not to become murderers. But now it is done, and we must live with it." The next entry was dated November 5, 1888. "We have buried all the dead in a mass grave on the eastern edge of the valley. The surviving Indians, 23 of them, agreed to leave peacefully in exchange for our promise to never speak of what happened. They went to the reservation, and we sent money with them, though no amount can atone for what occurred. We have agreed among ourselves to never discuss this tragedy. It will not bring back the dead, and it would destroy everything we're trying to build here. Better to let it be forgotten, buried with the bodies." I looked up at Robert. "This is evidence of a massacre." "It's evidence of a tragedy," Robert corrected. "A terrible, senseless tragedy born of fear, alcohol, and stupidity, but not a planned extermination. My ancestor spent the rest of his life trying to atone for what happened. He donated land for the reservation, funded schools, supported Salish communities. He was haunted by that night until he died." "That doesn't excuse covering it up," I said. "No, it doesn't, but put yourself in their position. They'd just witnessed something horrific. They were trying to build a town, create a future for their families. Revealing the massacre would have meant trials, possibly hangings, definitely the end of the settlement. So they buried it, literally and figuratively. And every generation since has maintained that cover-up. Every generation has had to decide whether dredging up a 135-year-old tragedy serves any purpose beyond causing pain. The people who committed those crimes are long dead. The victims are long dead. What good does it do to tear open that wound now? I didn't have a good answer. As a journalist, I believed in truth and transparency, but as a human being, I could see the complexity of the situation. This wasn't a simple story of good and evil. It was a story of human fallibility, of terrible choices made in difficult circumstances, of communities trying to move forward from trauma. "I need to think about this," I said. Robert nodded. "Take your time. But Emma, I want you to understand something. If you publish this story, you're not just affecting the founding families, you're affecting everyone in Clearwater. This town's entire identity is built on a version of history that excludes this massacre. Revealing it will fundamentally change how people see their home, their heritage, themselves." I left Robert's house with a copy of the relevant diary entries. He'd given them to me freely, which surprised me. "If you're determined to tell this story," he said, "I'd rather you have the primary source than rely on speculation." Over the next few weeks, I struggled with what to do. I conducted more research, interviewed more people, tried to build the complete picture of what had happened in November 1888. I learned that the Salish survivors had indeed gone to the reservation, and their descendants were still there. I traveled to the reservation and spoke with some of them. They confirmed the oral history that James Redfeather had shared, stories of a massacre, of family members who never returned from the valley, of promises made and broken. But I also learned something else. After the massacre, Josiah Thorne and the other settlers had sent more than just money to the reservation. They'd provided food during harsh winters, helped build schools, funded medical care. Not as reparations, that word was never used, but as what Thorne had called neighborly obligation. My great-great-grandfather always said the white people in that valley felt guilty about something. He said they helped our community more than most whites did. We never knew exactly why, but we accepted the help. We needed it. The story was more complicated than I initially thought. Yes, there had been a massacre. Yes, it had been covered up. But the aftermath wasn't simply erasure and denial. There had been attempts, however imperfect, at some form of amends. I wrote the article in January 2024. It took me 3 weeks to get it right, balancing the need for truth with sensitivity to all the people affected. I detailed the evidence of the 1888 massacre, included excerpts from Josiah Thorne's diary, presented the Salish oral history, and tried to give context to the decisions made by both the settlers and the survivors. I titled it, "The Clearing of Clearwater: Confronting Our Town's Hidden History." Before I published it, I showed the draft to several people, to James Redfeather and other tribal historians, to Robert Thorne and representatives of the other founding families, to Dorothy Chen and the other elderly residents, to Dr. Torres, the archaeologist, to my own journalism ethics professor from college. Everyone had different reactions. Some thought I should publish it immediately, some thought I should bury it forever, some thought I should modify it, emphasize different aspects, add more context. In the end, I published it in the Chronicle on February 9th, 2024, exactly 136 years after the massacre. The reaction was immediate and intense. Some people thanked me for bringing the truth to light. Others called me a traitor to the community, accused me of sensationalism, said I was trying to destroy the town's reputation. The founding families were divided. Some, like Robert Thorne, accepted the article as necessary. Others threatened legal action, though they never followed through. The Salish community had mixed reactions too. Some felt vindicated that their history was finally being acknowledged. Others felt the article didn't go far enough, that it was too sympathetic to the settlers. A few felt that I, as a white outsider, had no right to tell this story at all. The national media picked up the story. For a few weeks, Clearwater was in the news cycle. think pieces about frontier violence, discussions about how American towns reckon with dark histories, debates about journalism ethics and when to reveal painful truths. Then, like all news cycles, it faded. People moved on to the next story, the next controversy, the next crisis. But in Clearwater, things changed permanently. The town council, under pressure from both sides, formed a committee to address the massacre. They eventually agreed to several actions: a memorial on the site of the mass grave, once the Thorne family agreed to allow excavation and proper burial for the remains, inclusion of the massacre in school history curricula, a formal acknowledgement of what happened, and an annual remembrance ceremony. The Historical Society updated its exhibits to include the massacre. The library created a new section dedicated to Indigenous history. The local schools began teaching a more complete version of the town's founding. Not everyone was happy about these changes. A significant portion of the town felt I'd unnecessarily dragged up the past, that I'd tarnished Clearwater's reputation for no good reason. I received hate mail, angry phone calls, a few vague threats. Someone spray-painted "liar" on the Chronicle office window. But I also received letters of support from journalists who appreciated the commitment to truth, from educators who wanted to use the story in their classrooms, from Salish community members who felt their ancestors had finally been remembered, from younger residents who believed confronting the past was necessary for building a better future. The Chronicle lost subscribers. About 15% of our circulation canceled in the months after publication. Some local businesses pulled their advertising. The paper's financial situation became precarious. But we also gained new readers, people who appreciated that a small-town newspaper was willing to tell difficult truths. Foundations that funded journalism projects focused on historical accountability. Researchers who wanted to use Clearwater as a case study. It's been over a year now since I published the article. The town is still processing what it means. The memorial was dedicated last month, in November 2024, 136 years after the massacre. It was a somber ceremony, attended by descendants of both the settlers and the victims. There were speeches about reconciliation, about remembering, about moving forward while honoring the past. I don't know if I made the right decision. Journalism textbooks say you always publish the truth, but real life is messier than textbooks. I revealed a secret that had been kept for 136 years, and in doing so, I changed my community in ways I'm still trying to understand. Some days I think I did the right thing. Truth matters, even when it's painful, especially when it's painful. Communities can't build genuine relationships without honesty about their shared history. Other days, I wonder if I was arrogant to think I had the right to make that choice for an entire town. Who was I, someone who'd lived in Clearwater for less than 2 years, to decide it was time to reveal a secret that generations had kept? Dorothy Chen died 3 months after my article was published. Before she passed, she asked to see me. I visited her in the nursing home, and she held my hand with surprising strength. "My grandmother would be proud of you," she said. "She always believed the truth should be told, even when it hurts, especially when it hurts." "Do you think I did the right thing?" I asked her. Dorothy smiled. "Child, there's no such thing as simply right when you're dealing with history and pain and memory. But you did a brave thing. You honored the dead by refusing to let them be forgotten. That counts for something." I still work at the Chronicle. Subscribers are slowly returning, and we're finding our footing again. I write about city council meetings and high school sports and the county fair, just like I did before. But the town is different now, subtly changed by the knowledge of its own history. The founding families are different too. Robert Thorne and I have developed an unlikely friendship. He tells me stories about his great-great-grandfather that never made it into the diary, the ways Josiah Thorne was haunted by what happened in November 1888. "He was a complicated man," Robert says. He did something terrible, and he spent his life trying to make up for it. That doesn't excuse what he did, but it makes him human. The Salish community in Clearwater have begun building new relationships. There are cultural exchange programs now, educational partnerships, conversations that should have happened decades ago. It's awkward sometimes, fraught with the weight of history and hurt, but it's happening. I learned something important through this experience. The truth doesn't set you free so much as it complicates everything. Before I published the article, Clearwater's history was simple: pioneers building a town in the wilderness. Now it's messy, painful, full of moral ambiguity and generational trauma. But maybe that's okay. Maybe we don't need simple stories. Maybe we need complicated truths. James Redfeather told me something after the article was published. He said, "In our tradition, truth-telling is sacred work, but it comes with responsibility. You don't just reveal truth and walk away. You stay with the community as it processes that truth. You help carry the weight of what you've uncovered." So that's what I'm doing. I'm staying in Clearwater, carrying the weight of the story I told, watching as the town slowly transforms its understanding of itself. It's hard work, often thankless, sometimes frightening, but it's also the most important journalism I've ever done. Not because it got national attention or won awards or made me famous, because it mattered to real people in a real community trying to reckon with their real history. That's what journalism is supposed to be, not clicks and virality and trending topics, but truth in service of community, even when that truth is painful, especially when it's painful. The mass grave was excavated last spring. Forensic anthropologists confirmed the remains of 47 individuals, consistent with Josiah Thorne's diary entry. They were reburied in a ceremony that honored both Salish traditions and Christian practices, reflecting the complex heritage of everyone involved in this story. I attended the burial. I watched as descendants of the victims and descendants of the perpetrators stood together in the rain, grieving for people who died 136 years ago. And I thought about how history isn't just dates and facts in books. It's living memory, passed down through generations, shaping communities in ways we don't always recognize. Clearwater will never be the simple small town I thought I was moving to. It's more complicated now, more honest, maybe more broken in some ways, but also more whole because we're not pretending anymore. We're not hiding from our own past. The Chronicle's office still has boxes of angry letters in storage. The spray paint on our window was never fully removed. You can still see the ghost of that word liar if you look closely. I keep it as a reminder that truth-telling has consequences, that not everyone will thank you for it. But I also received letters of support from journalists who appreciated the commitment to truth, from educators who wanted to use the story in their classrooms, from Salish community members who felt their ancestors had finally been remembered, from younger residents who believed confronting the past was necessary for building a better future. I don't regret publishing the story, but I don't feel triumphant about it either. Mostly, I feel the weight of responsibility to continue telling the truth, to honor the people affected by this history, to help this community process what it means to confront its past. That's what journalism is at its best, not exposing secrets for the sake of exposure, but telling truths in service of understanding, healing, and justice, even when those truths have been buried for 136 years. Especially then,